He's innocent! I have my own evidence.
Clara Morrow stood in the center of the silent federal courtroom, her white cane tapping softly against the cold marble as a sea of spectators held their breath. In her trembling hands, she clutched a bouquet of crushed lilies, the only thing she had left from her stall outside. "He's innocent," she said, her voice small but piercing through the heavy air, her sightless eyes fixed forward with a resolve that silenced the room. At the defense table, Julian Cross, the city's most feared don, sat alone. His own brother had just walked out, taking every high-priced lawyer and ally with him, leaving Julian to face a life sentence in total isolation. Julian lifted his guarded face, his dark, weary eyes searching the woman he'd passed 1,000 times on the courthouse steps. For the first time in his life, he felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. None of them knew that this fragile moment was the beginning of an explosion, the unraveling of a blood-soaked betrayal by the very family Julian protected, a conspiracy that had cost Clara her sight and her twin brother's life 5 years ago. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden secrets, ruthless betrayal, and the woman who saw what the world missed, tell me in the comments, do you believe justice always finds a way? If you love stories about the invisible people standing up to giants, don't forget to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss the moment a former elite agent reveals her true face. But before the verdict changes everything, what do you think gave Clara the courage to step out of the shadows for a man the world calls a monster? The sirens were the last thing Clara Morrow ever truly saw, flickering strobes of red and blue reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement of the shipping yard. As a lead acoustic analyst for the FBI, Clara lived in a world of waveforms and frequencies, but that night, the soundscape was a jagged mess of shouting and heavy boots. Beside her, her twin brother Leo, a field agent with a smile that could light up the darkest surveillance van, checked his sidearm. They were minutes away from dismantling the Cross Syndicate's grip on the East Coast. "Stay behind the pillar, Clara," Leo had whispered, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "Once we secure the hard drives, we're home free." Clara had adjusted her headset, her fingers dancing over the digital recorder. She wasn't supposed to be in the line of fire, but the whisper technology the syndicate used required her ears on sight. Through her monitors, she heard at first, a faint, rhythmic ticking that didn't belong to the hum of the cooling fans or the distant rhythm of the city. It was the sound of a countdown. "Leo, get out. It's a trap," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by a roar that defied description. The world didn't just explode, it shattered. The heat was a physical wall, a white-hot fist that slammed into her chest and threw her backward. Then came the silence, not a peaceful quiet, but a terrifying, absolute void where the screams of the dying and the crackle of fire should have been. Her vision, once sharp enough to spot a hidden wire from 20 feet, dissolved into a searing white veil, then plunged into an eternal, suffocating ink. She lay on the freezing concrete, her lungs burning with the acrid stench of cordite and burning rubber. She tried to call for Leo, but her throat was filled with ash. She felt the vibration of the ground, heavy, frantic footsteps, and then the heat of the secondary fires drawing closer. She was a ghost in a burning graveyard, waiting for the end. Then, through the ringing in her ears, she felt a pair of powerful hands slide beneath her shoulders. The person didn't speak, but she could hear his ragged, heavy breathing, a sound of desperation, not malice. She smelled expensive tobacco and iron, a scent that would later become synonymous with the man the world called a monster. "My brother." She wheezed, her fingers clawing at the stranger's silk-lined sleeves. The man paused. Clara felt him look back into the inferno where Leo had been standing. For a second, the heartbeat of the man holding her spiked, a frantic rhythm of regret. He didn't answer, but he tightened his grip, shielding her body with his own as a second blast rocked the foundation. He carried her through the debris, his footsteps sure and authoritative, dragging her away from the tomb that had just claimed her twin and her sight. He laid her down near the perimeter, far enough for the paramedics to find her but close enough for her to hear his final, whispered command to someone else, "Tell Daniel the girl is dead." If he finds out she breathed a word of what she heard, none of us survive. Before she could scream, before she could even reach out to touch the face of her savior, he was gone, leaving her in a world that had gone forever dark, haunted by the sound of a heartbeat that shouldn't have been there. For 5 long years, Clara Morrow became a fixture of the pavement, as much a part of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse as the limestone pillars she leaned against. To the high-powered attorneys and bustling clerks, she was merely the blind girl with the lilies, a tragic, invisible piece of the city's background noise. But while the world thought her senses were broken, they had actually become her greatest weapon. She had traded the visual data of FBI monitors for the raw, unfiltered symphony of the street, learning to read the city through the vibrations in the concrete and the rhythm of the life passing by. Every morning, she arrived before the first gavel fell, setting up her small wooden stand. She didn't need to see the expensive silk ties or the polished leather brogues to know who was walking past. She knew the frantic, uneven gait of the terrified whistleblower, the heavy, arrogant stomp of the corporate shark, and the light, ghostly tread of the man with a guilty conscience. Her ears, trained in forensic acoustics, processed every sound as a data point. She could hear the distinct metallic click of a concealed firearm under a tailored jacket and the subtle catch in a man's breath when he lied to the cameras. She lived in a world of echoes and patterns. She knew that Judge Miller always favored his left leg when he was carrying a heavy bribe in his briefcase, and she knew exactly which district attorney smelled like expensive bourbon at 10 in the morning. She was a silent record keeper of the city's corruption, collecting the sonic fingerprints of the powerful and the damned. But most of all, she listened for one specific sound, the one that had haunted her dreams since the night of the explosion. She was waiting for the heavy, rhythmic stride of the man who had pulled her from the fire. For years, she had sat in the cold and the rain, selling her flowers, her head tilted slightly to the side, filtering through the thousands of footsteps that crossed those marble steps. She knew that one day, the man with the tobacco and iron scent would return to this building. The people who tossed spare change into her jar never realized that the poor flower girl was actually running a silent surveillance operation. They didn't know that behind her dark glasses, Clara was mapping the secret alliances of the New York underworld, waiting for the moment when the sounds of the past would collide with the justice of the present. She had become a ghost who heard everything, a witness who couldn't see but knew exactly where the bodies were buried, not by sight, but by the weight of the footsteps that walked over them. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a groan that vibrated through the soles of Clara's shoes, signaling the arrival of the man she had waited 5 years to hear. The sound of his approach was unmistakable, the rhythmic, heavy stride of a leader, now punctuated by the metallic, melodic clinking of shackles. Julian Cross was being led in, not as the untouchable don of the city, but as a prisoner of the state. As he passed her stall in the hallway, the familiar scent of expensive tobacco and cold iron drifted toward her, more pungent than the lilies in her hand. But beneath it, Clara's trained ears caught something new, the jagged, shallow breathing of a man who knew he was walking into a slaughterhouse. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the electric hum of a trap being sprung. Clara took her usual place in the back row, her head tilted, filtering the room. She heard Julian take his seat at the defense table, the leather creaking under his weight. Then, she heard the footsteps of his brother, Daniel Voss. Daniel's gait was a masterpiece of deception, light, polished, and perfectly timed, but Clara heard the micro-stutter in his step, the subtle click of a man who was vibrating with a dark, triumphant energy. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, but the real movement was happening at the defense table. Clara leaned forward, her brow furrowing. She heard the simultaneous shuffling of chairs and the synchronized retreat of 8 pairs of high-end Italian loafers. Julian's legal team, a phalanx of the most expensive attorneys money could buy, were moving away from him in a cold, rehearsed unison. "Your Honor," the lead counsel's voice rang out, devoid of any loyalty. "Due to a conflict of interest that has just come to light, this entire firm must recuse itself from the defense of Mr. Cross. Effective immediately." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Julian's heartbeat, usually a steady drum, spiked into a frantic, chaotic rhythm. He was alone. In a move of calculated cruelty, Daniel had not just bought the prosecution, he had purchased Julian's own shield, leaving him defenseless before a judge who was already holding the gavel like a tombstone. From the gallery, Daniel's breathing leveled out into a slow, satisfied purr. He had stripped Julian of his power, his family, and his future in a single stroke. Julian sat motionless, the chains on his wrists rattling softly as he realized the magnitude of the betrayal. He was a lion in a cage, surrounded by hyenas wearing suits. But in the back of the room, Clara felt the weight of the crushed lilies in her hand and the fire of the FBI agent she used to be. She heard the injustice in the silence, a frequency so loud it was deafening. The brother had spoken his lies through silence, and now, it was time for the blind girl to speak the truth. Clara didn't wait for the judge to ask for a volunteer. She stood, the tapping of her cane a sharp, rhythmic punctuation mark that sliced through the murmurs of the stunned gallery. As she moved toward the witness stand, she could feel the heat of Daniel Voss's stare, a gaze she couldn't see, but one that felt like a predator's breath on her neck. She took the oath with a hand that didn't shake, her fingers still stained with the scent of the lilies she had laid aside. The prosecution claims Julian cross-executed the victim at point-blank range, Clara began, her voice gaining a resonance that seemed to expand the very walls of the courtroom. But the eyes are easily deceived by a well-placed silhouette and a coordinated lie. Sound, however, has no shadow. The prosecutor scoffed, a dry, sharp sound of dismissal, but the judge leaned forward, intrigued by the blind woman who spoke with the authority of a general. Clara closed her eyes, or rather, she leaned into the darkness she had mastered. The night of the murder, I wasn't just selling flowers. I was listening, she said. I heard the killer approach the alleyway. A man's stride is as unique as a fingerprint. Julian crosswalks with a heavy, deliberate heel-to-toe strike, the gait of a man who carries the world on his shoulders. But the man who pulled the trigger that night had a different rhythm. He walked with a slight, metallic hitch in his right hip, a sound like a silver coin clicking against a stone. A heavy silence descended as Clara turned her head toward the gallery, unerringly locating the exact spot where Daniel Voss sat. The heartbeat I heard that night wasn't the frantic thrum of a man caught in a crime. It was slow. Cold. A rhythmic pulsing that matched the ticking of a high-end Swiss watch. And I'm hearing that exact same heartbeat right now, sitting 20 feet behind me. She described the acoustics of the alleyway, how the sound of the suppressed gunshot had bounced off the brick walls, revealing the height and arm span of the shooter. She spoke of the frequency of the killer's breathing, a shallow, whistling sound caused by a deviated septum, a detail she had noted in Daniel's brother for months. As she spoke, the room transformed. The jurors weren't looking at a blind girl anymore, they were looking through her ears. She reconstructed the crime scene in the air, a phantom world made of echoes and truth. Julian Cross sat frozen, his eyes fixed on Clara with a burning intensity. He recognized the technical precision in her voice, the forensic edge he had encountered once before in a burning shipping yard. Daniel Voss, meanwhile, shifted in his seat, the leather creaking with a sudden, frantic tension. The click of his hip, once a secret, was now a siren in the silence. Clara had turned the courtroom into a giant microphone, and for the first time in 5 years, the guilty had nowhere to hide. The prosecutor stepped forward, a sneer twisting his features as he gestured toward Clara's white cane. Your Honor, this is a farce. We are entertaining the auditory fantasies of a blind flower girl. She has no credentials, no standing, and certainly no scientific basis for these claims. Clara stood taller, the air around her seemingly sharpening as she reached into the pocket of her simple cardigan. She didn't pull out a business card, she pulled out a weathered, silver-cased thumb drive and a small, laminated card that had been tucked away for 5 years. She handed them to the court clerk. My name is Clara Morrow, she said, her voice dropping into a low, clinical tone that froze the room. And I am not just a flower seller. I was the lead forensic acoustic analyst for the FBI's Special Operations Division, badge number 7741. That drive contains the spectral analysis software I developed, the same software currently used by the Bureau to identify terrorists through voice print and gait rhythm recognition. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge's eyebrows shot up as he examined the FBI credentials. Julian Cross narrowed his eyes, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He hadn't saved a helpless girl that night, he had saved the very agent who had been hunting him. I chose to stay dead to the world because the explosion that took my sight was not an accident, Clara continued, her sightless eyes seeming to pierce through the judge's bench. It was an inside job orchestrated by Daniel Voss to eliminate the only two people who knew he was selling his brother's secrets to foreign conglomerates. My twin brother, Leo, died in that fire. I survived, but I knew that if Daniel found out I was alive, he would finish what he started. She explained how she had used her death as a shield, living on the courthouse steps to monitor the very people who had destroyed her life. She had spent 5 years in the dark, refining her ears to become a living lie detector, waiting for the one man who could lead her to the heart of the conspiracy. I didn't step forward today to save a Mafia don, she said, her voice trembling with 5 years of repressed grief. I stepped forward to expose the man who murdered a federal agent and stole my life. I am Clara Morrow, and I am the witness you couldn't see coming. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Daniel Voss's face had drained of all color, he wasn't looking at a blind girl anymore. He was looking at his executioner. Clara had spent half a decade as a ghost, but as she stood there, the elite agent was finally back in the light, and she was finished hiding. The silence following Clara's revelation was not peaceful, it was a pressurized chamber on the verge of imploding. As the judge ordered a recess to verify the startling credentials, the courtroom erupted into a chaotic hum of whispers. But Clara didn't need eyes to feel the shift in the air. She felt the heavy, predatory presence of Daniel Voss moving toward her before he even took a step. His footsteps were different now, no longer the polished, rhythmic stride of a confident man, but a sharp, aggressive staccato that radiated a cold, focused fury. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could smell the expensive citrus of his cologne mixed with the metallic scent of his sudden, violent sweat. A ghost, he whispered, his voice a low, jagged blade that only Clara could hear. I should have known a professional like you wouldn't just vanish. But remember this, Clara, a ghost can be exorcised. You think these walls protect you? You think Julian, a man in chains, can keep you safe? He leaned closer, and the sound of his breathing became a rhythmic hiss in her ear. I've spent 5 years perfecting the art of making people disappear. I didn't just kill Leo. I erased him. I can do the same to you, and this time, there won't be enough of you left to leave an echo. As he walked away, the click of his prosthetic hip sounded like the cocking of a hammer in the quiet hallway. But the psychological game was only beginning. Over the next hour, as Clara sat in the witness room, the sounds around her began to warp. A janitor's cart rattling in the distance mimicked the sound of the countdown timer from the night of the explosion. The hiss of the ventilation system sounded like a gas leak. Every door that closed was a gunshot, every muffled voice was a threat. Daniel was using her own gift against her, flooding her world with auditory triggers he knew would rattle a survivor of trauma. He wanted her to doubt her senses, to pull her back into the burning shipping yard where she had lost everything. Clara gripped her white cane until her knuckles turned white, her heart racing in a chaotic, panicked frequency. Suddenly, a hand touched her shoulder. She flinched, her breath catching in a sob, but then she caught the scent, tobacco and cold iron. Don't let him in your head, Clara, Julian's voice was a low, steady bass that cut through the noise. He had been granted a brief moment with her under heavy guard. He's loud because he's losing. He plays with the shadows because he's afraid of the light you just turned on. Listen to my heart. It's steady. I'm not going anywhere. Clara leaned toward the sound of his chest, using his calm, rhythmic pulse to filter out the jagged edges of Daniel's terror. The predator was hunting, but for the first time in 5 years, the prey had a protector who knew exactly how the monster moved. The sun had barely begun to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the courthouse steps, when the atmosphere shifted from the stagnant heat of the afternoon to something cold and lethal. Clara stood by her stall, her hands mechanically arranging a spray of white roses, flowers for the dead, she thought grimly. The trial had been adjourned for the day, and the city felt unnaturally quiet. But Clara wasn't fooled by the silence. She heard the distant, high-pitched whine of a motorcycle engine approaching, a sound that didn't match the heavy, sluggish flow of rush-hour traffic. The bike was accelerating, the gear shifts sharp and aggressive. Beneath the roar of the engine, her ears caught the faint, metallic snick-snick of a submachine gun being readied. It was a sound she knew from 100 FBI training simulations, a sound that meant death was seconds away. "Get down," a voice roared. Before she could move, a wall of muscle slammed into her. It was Julian's lead security detail, a man whose footsteps were as heavy as lead and whose scent was of gunpowder and cheap coffee. He tackled her behind the stone base of a courthouse pillar just as the air was ripped apart by the rhythmic, deafening chatter of automatic fire. The stone above her head disintegrated into a spray of grit and dust. The scent of her roses was instantly replaced by the biting, sulphurous stench of cordite. From the other side of the street, the thump-thump of return fire echoed. Julian's loyalists, the few who hadn't been bought by Daniel, had been waiting in the shadows. The street became a chaotic theater of acoustics, the screech of tires, the clatter of shell casings hitting the pavement like hailstones, and the panicked screams of bystanders. Through the cacophony, Clara heard the motorcycle skid, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the assassin realized the hit had failed. "We have to move." Now, the guard shouted over the ringing in her ears. She was hoisted to her feet and shoved into the back of a black SUV that had pulled onto the sidewalk with a violent lurch. As the door slammed shut, she felt the familiar vibration of the engine and the scent of tobacco and iron. Julian was already inside, his breathing heavy and ragged, his hands shackled but his presence overwhelming. "They're not playing games anymore," Julian said, his voice vibrating with a dark, protective fury. "Daniel knows the court won't silence you, so he's trying to bury you." The vehicle sped away, weaving through the labyrinthine streets of Lower Manhattan. Clara sat in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were heading to a safe house, a fortified bunker hidden beneath the skin of the city. As the sounds of the street faded into the muffled hum of an underground tunnel, Clara realized the flower cellar was gone forever. She was back in the war, and this time, the only person she could trust was the very man she had once been sent to destroy. The safe house had been a sanctuary of shadows, but the courtroom was a stage of blinding white light as Clara returned for the final hour of the trial. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and floor wax, but beneath the mundane, Clara tracked the jagged, panicked rhythm of Daniel Voss's breathing. He was sitting in the front row, his movements sharp and frantic, a contrast to the deathly stillness of Julian Cross. Clara stepped to the evidence locker, her fingers finding a small, high-fidelity speaker system. "The prosecution has dismissed the surveillance audio from the night of the explosion as unintelligible static," Clara said, her voice dropping into the cool, precise register of the agent she used to be. "But to the trained ear, static is just a curtain. And I am about to pull it back." She pressed a key, and a low-frequency hum filled the room, a chaotic soup of white noise, wind, and crackling fire. To the jury, it sounded like a broken radio. To Clara, it was a map. "Listen past the wind," she commanded, her head tilting toward the speakers. At the 42-second mark, there is a rhythmic mechanical oscillation. Most would call it a distant engine. But look at the spectral readout. As the waveform appeared on the monitors, Clara began to narrate the invisible. "That oscillation is the cooling fan of a very specific high-end server, the kind found in the Voss conglomerate's mobile command unit. And there, at the 60 decibel spike, is the sound of a prosthetic gate hitting a hollow metal floor. A click that matches Daniel Voss's hip exactly." The courtroom held its collective breath. Clara adjusted a filter on the console, stripping away the roar of the fire. Suddenly, a voice emerged from the hiss, thin, distorted, but unmistakably Daniel's. Make sure the girl doesn't get out. I want the twin and the agent buried in the same hole. The sound of Daniel's own voice, cold and murderous, hung in the air like a physical weight. The unintelligible noise was gone, replaced by the crystal-clear sound of a death warrant. Clara turned her sightless eyes toward the sound of Daniel's frantic heartbeat. Guilt has a frequency, Daniel, she whispered into the microphone, her voice echoing through the chamber. It vibrates at a pitch most people are too loud to hear. But I've been listening to you in the dark for 5 years. I know the sound of your lies, and I know the sound of your fear. And right now, the whole world is finally hearing it, too. Daniel bolted for the door, his footsteps a panicked, uneven mess of sound, but he didn't even make it to the aisle. The click of his hip was drowned out by the heavy, authoritative clack of the bailiff's boots as they intercepted him. The sound of guilt had finally been amplified, and in the silence that followed, Clara heard the only thing that mattered, the slow, steady exhale of Julian Cross, finally free. The heavy, metallic thud of the courtroom doors closing behind Daniel Voss was the last sound of a war that had lasted 5 years. As the bailiffs led him away, the frantic, jagged rhythm of his footsteps finally faded into the distance, replaced by a silence that felt different than before. It was no longer a silence of secrets and fear, but one of absolute, ringing clarity. The weight of the world seemed to lift from the room, leaving behind only the soft hum of the city outside and the steady, grounding heartbeat of the man sitting just a few feet away. Julian Cross stood slowly, the shackles on his wrists clinking one last time before the guards, acting on the judge's immediate order for release, stepped forward to unlock them. The sound of the key turning in the lock was a small, sharp melody of freedom. He didn't move toward the exit or toward the cameras waiting like hungry predators in the hallway. Instead, he walked toward Clara. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, a sound Clara had memorized in the fire and tracked through the dark for half a decade. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither spoke. The scent of tobacco and cold iron remained, but the jagged edges of his anxiety had smoothed into something warm and protective. You stayed in the dark for me, Julian said, his voice a low, resonant bass that vibrated through Clara's very core. You gave up your life to wait for a man who didn't even know your name. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the silk of his sleeve before finding the rough, warm skin of his hand. I didn't stay in the dark for a Mafia don, Julian. I stayed for the man who reached back into the fire when the world was falling apart. You saved me when I had no voice. I just returned the favor. Julian took her hand, his grip firm and steady. The debt between them, a life for a life, a brother for a brother, was finally settled. He had been her shield in the fire, and she had been his eyes in the courtroom. Now, as the evening light filtered through the high windows of the courthouse, warming the marble beneath their feet, they stood as two survivors of the same wreckage. The flower stall is gone, Julian whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles. And the FBI agent is back. What happens now? Clara tilted her head, listening to the peaceful rhythm of his heart. For the first time in 5 years, Julian, I don't have to listen for danger. I think I'd like to just listen to the quiet. Julian led her out of the courtroom, not as a kingpin and a witness, but as two souls stepping out of the shadows. As they reached the top of the courthouse steps, the same steps where she had sat for years in the rain, Clara took a deep breath of the evening air. The world was still dark to her eyes, but with Julian beside her, it was finally full of light. They walked down the stairs together, their footsteps falling into a perfect, synchronized rhythm, the sound of a new beginning.